We're going to begin a two-part series on hyperinflation, looking at some of the history of it. And then in the second portion, we're going to look at ways that we can avoid suffering some of the worst results of hyperinflation. Hey everybody, Chad Cruiser here with Health and Homestead. We're going to start with the most notorious history of hyperinflation, and that was the Weimar Republic. So during World War I, Germany went into various European countries. They stole all kinds of things like their art, they stole their gold, various things. They brought these things back to Germany. Finally, the Allied powers ganged up, they came back and they put a stop to this and they won the war, and then they wanted to punish Germany for their involvement in this war, and so Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. And what happened was they had to pay back nearly $270 billion in today's currency anyway, of gold-backed marks. And so you can imagine how difficult this was for Germany to have to deal with. Now the basic idea was they were trying to spur on the economy in Europe again. And so what happened was, as they were shipping it over, they were shipping over gold, but people just weren't using it all that much. They were saving it because of the difficult times they were in. And finally they got another idea. The idea was that they would take a gold-backed currency, and instead of sending gold over to these other countries, they would just send the marks, and instead of people just saving it up, then they began to spend it, and it began to spur on the economy. So they were shipping these gold-backed marks to these various countries, and then they began to think after a couple of years, hey, nobody would really know if this money wasn't backed by gold, so what if we took it off the gold standard and just shipped off paper money to these people? They wouldn't know anyway. And so that's what they did. And before World War I, it was about 4 Reichsmarks to the American dollar at the time. So let's just say $1 for one chicken, well, it would be 4 Reichsmark for a chicken, just to give an idea of what it might be like. But very rapidly, because they were printing more money, it went from 4 marks to the dollar to 9 marks to the dollar. And by the time we get to July of 1919, it was 14 marks to the dollar. So the marks are becoming worth less and less over time. So the economists came up with a great idea. They realized, hey, if they're devaluing our currency by 60%, because it kept going down, 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 they thought, well, if they devalue it by that much, we'll just print that much more. And that's what they ended up doing. And by January of 1920, it was now 65 Reichsmarks to the dollar. So now at this point, the people were really beginning to feel the inflation. But the politicians, they themselves began to feel it also. So they came up with a great idea. They signed legislation so that every time there was a devaluation of the currency, they would get a raise. So they got to the point where they didn't have to worry about inflation at all. But keep in mind, that was only for the politicians. By January of 1922, the inflation had gone up to 190 Reichsmarks to the dollar. Now, at some point, they came up with an ingenious device that was on the cash registers. And what that was they began to realize inflation was going up so rapidly, they would put a device on the cash register that has been called the multiplier. That would, every time you would hear a click, it would raise the price of what was in your cart by 10%. Now, by July of 1922, it came to 460 Reichsmarks to the dollar. And when you were in the grocery store, every 30 seconds you would hear a click on that cash register, and that means everything you put in your cart went up by 10%. You can imagine this began to create a real buying frenzy, and you can see why serious inflation can be very detrimental to people's mental health, because people begin to constantly think about money because it begins to devalue over and over and over. By January of 1923, the price had now gone to 8,000 Reichsmarks to the dollar. And this really changed things in the factories. So the workers in the factories realized, hey, we can't get paid every 2 weeks. The cost is just skyrocketing. So they made an agreement that they would get paid every week. And you can imagine that was helpful, but it wasn't good enough because the inflation was going up so rapidly. So finally they made an agreement that they would get paid every single day. But like I said, it's going up every 30 seconds, 10%. Finally, they made a contract that they would get paid every single hour. And I've heard the story go that they would take every single hour of that money, they would run outside of the factory or the place that they were working, and they would give that money to their wife or whoever it was, and they would rush to the store to buy something before the prices went up. I mean, they were still going up on the way, obviously, at this point, but you can imagine the frenzied living experience that people must have been going through at the time. This began to create a serious problem for money printing. They got to the point where the most important job in the country, the most productive work in the country, was printing paper to produce all of these bills that were running. They had something like 16 mills running 24 hours a day, just printing off money, money, money. But then they got to the point where they were printing it so fast, there just wasn't enough time to print on both sides. And then once it was at least 10,000 marks to the dollar, it was no longer worth totally printing these, and so they just added stamps on top of the old bills. Now, by August of 1923, it was at 4.6 million marks to the dollar. And from what I understand, it was in that month that you see American economists from Harvard, I think there were 5 of them, who had been working to try to get the economy stimulated in Europe and helping out Germany to pay back their reparations. They basically said, okay, we're gonna head back home. You guys can take it from here. There wasn't much hope for the German economy at this point. By September of 1923, the price had gone up to 100 million to the dollar, and every 15 seconds, this is hard to believe, but every 15 seconds, the price would go up by 100%. I mean, you can understand why this is called hyperinflation. And by October of 1923, it was 25 billion Reichsmarks to the dollar, and it might be hard to believe that it could be inflating this bad. Finally, by November of 1923, the Reichsmark had gone from 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. And at this point, it was worth nothing. It got to the point where it was totally useless. There was no point even using it. You probably heard the old story of somebody carrying down the road a wheelbarrow filled with Reichsmarks, and the wheelbarrow was worth more money than the cash that was filling that wheelbarrow. Kids would use it to play with. People started using it as scrap paper. It became utterly worthless. And this is what ends up happening at the end of a hyperinflationary period, as the idea goes that money becomes nothing, or as we read in that passage, it says money came to naught. I don't think that was talking about Germany. I think that is a future event there. This is one of the things that led to Hitler coming to power. Because Germany's economy was destroyed, the people were looking for someone, and here came someone who promised to help them out and take them back and make Germany something better. And so that's what ended up happening there. So there are lessons we can learn from printing money. Much of this information I got from the late Larry Burkett. I really appreciate some of his historical information. There's also a great book about this, When Money Dies. I'm going to leave a link for that down in the description if you have any interest in checking it out. Now you may think, man, I'm sure planet Earth has learned their lesson from that time. Nobody would ever do that again. The trouble is multiple countries have done that since that time period, and it's happening today in certain countries in the world where people are living present tense in a hyperinflation in their country. And so on our next video, I want to share with you some of the experience of what it's like to go through a hyperinflationary period and some of the things that we can do to make it less likely for us to suffer as much during that time period. Now, it makes everybody suffer to a degree, but looking back at history, we can learn lessons that will teach us how to deal with that if that were to ever come. I'm not saying it's going to happen here, but what if it did? It's always better to know. You probably heard it said that Mark Twain had spoken these words. He said, "History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes." So it's going to be a little bit different in different time periods and in different localities, but it's always beneficial to get an idea. If we forget the past, you probably heard the saying, you're going to be doomed to what? Repeat it. So we're going to look into in our next video to find out what can we do potentially to make it less likely for a country to go through this and for our own personal family to suffer as a result, even if it did come into our own backyard. Some of you might be watching this from a country who's going through this at this very present time. I'd love to hear some of your comments down below. And if you like this video, hit the subscribe button. You're going to want to wait and see the upcoming video as we go deeper into detail on this. And there's a link below for the book on this subject, one of the books that's quite fascinating. God bless and have a fantastic day.